Oh, cool. Okay, I can start. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Harry. I'm a developer from Theodo. I've been working with React Native and React for the last year or so, and this is to talk about atomic design. But just by way of hands, has anyone come across this before? A few of you. Okay, cool. I did choose, after I chose the title Up an Atom, I realized that Radioactive Man's catchphrase doesn't really work in an English accent, but I kept it anyway because he is one of the earliest proponents of React. So I'll start with a story. So once upon a time, there was a group of developers who wanted to start a React project, and they wanted to keep it as neat as possible. So they had their components folder, and then they thought, okay, we're going to start with some fields. So inside here, we'll create a folder called fields. And then we had some reusable things, which were groups of fields together, like an address. So they thought, okay, we'll put them in a field sets folder and still keep organized. But then we came across something which we didn't know where it should go. So then we thought, okay, we'll create a common folder where this can go. And very soon, everything that we came up with went into this common folder until it eventually collapsed into a black hole, absorbing all components which were doomed never to escape. So then someone new joined the project and was like, what is going on? And they suggested that maybe we should use atomic design. So this is the story of that journey. I should emphasize that these aren't rules. This is just an approach that we took to try and solve this problem and some of the problems that we faced when using it and may be useful for you. So in this talk, there's 3 sections, like all good stories. So in the beginning, very generically talk about what atomic design is and why it's a good idea. And then in the last section, I'll talk about what happens when we try to combine that with React. So chapter 1, what is atomic design? So this was something that was developed by Brad Frost, who's a front-end developer. And he designed it because he was getting very similar problem to what we were describing, but with static pages. He was creating these huge templates that were really not maintainable or easy to understand. So he says that in his book, atomic design is a methodology composed of 5 distinct stages working together to create interface design systems in a more deliberate and hierarchical manner. I'm still not entirely sure what that means, but I think the key thing is that there are 5 distinct stages. And that's what I'll focus on today. So these are the stages. So at the bottom, we have atoms, and then these combine to make molecules, and then organisms, templates, and pages. So to go through these one by one, atoms are the simple building blocks that make up all user interfaces. So things like labels, fields, and buttons. Molecules are then simple groups of atoms working together as a unit. So for example, in my app Mooba, this is a search bar which is made up of a label, a field, and a button. Then an organism is a slightly more complex part of an interface which is made up of atoms, molecules, and other organisms. So for example, that might be my header bar, which has my search bar, but also a logo and the background at the back. Then one up, I have templates, which are groups of organisms stitched together to form pages without content. So, for example, here I have a typical blog post or article page. And then finally, I have the pages which are specific instances of those templates with actual content. So here is a nice article. Moving on to chapter 2, why is this a good idea? So one is that I think it's structure that's easy to grasp and use from day one. It doesn't depend on the project. So I know on previous projects, like the one I described, we've tried and gone organically depending on what's needed at the time. But this is something that applies to a lot of scenarios. And it's very easy for new developers to understand very quickly with the hierarchy and the metaphor. I actually asked one of the new developers on the project, and they said, I like it. So I'm convinced. So advantage 2, I think, so atoms and molecules are kind of like your own Bootstrap. The typical flow that we would go through is that someone would give us a comp, for example, using Sketch, but these don't always end well. There's a great quote in the book, which is, presenting fully baked Photoshop comps is the most effective way to show your clients what their website will never look like, which I think is very good. So, I mean, you start with, because, we come across issues like different screen sizes, and then you have new pages which come from like new demands or customer feedback, and they don't have a comp. So that's why, whether or not you like them or not, things like Bootstrap or Material UI for React are very popular because it's easy to build lots of pages really quickly in a way that looks consistent and nice. So even if you start with comps, I think using something like Atomic Design makes it easy to have some of those benefits. So for example, I might start with the page I showed you earlier, and then I might have a search result page, and then suddenly one day they'll say, oh, we need postcode lookup. And then using some of the components that I've used so far, then I can put together something quickly that looks pretty good. And the book actually suggests going further than that and not even having comps to start with, and having maybe style tiles. So rather than full design, just the flavor of what the site will look like. Another advantage is that smaller components means that it's easier to think about responsive design. So this is something I know that I'm quite bad at, because we'll build the whole page, and then when it comes to thinking responsively, I'll think about the whole page in one go, and then I'll be overwhelmed by the task, and then it just won't be responsive. But when you think on these kind of smaller levels, then it's easier to tackle the problem. So for example, from earlier, if I was working on the header bar, then maybe I could focus on just making that responsive. And then even if I put it in my mobile site and the rest of it still looks pretty crap, it's a good start. And also, I'm also bad at remembering that responsive means responsive to data as well. So again, this is something that I might typically put just in one render component, but if I broke it down, then I would avoid things like this, where I've forgotten that actually some people have long names. And the final example, advantage, I think, is that hierarchical components make it easier to handle complete redesigns in your app because you have the structure. So here is my artist rendition of a typical React project. I probably exaggerated what it's like, but it proves my point, so it's fine. But if you start with atoms and work upwards, then maybe it's slightly easier to tackle the problem. And also, you can continue developing new features at the higher levels while redesigning lower ones, which I think is quite cool. Like we have another project at the moment who are working on a redesign, and they're struggling because all of the design is kind of spread out between the different components. So those are some very general advantages of why it's a good idea. So now we'll go into combining it with React, which, so on paper, React should be really great for Atomic Design. When I was listing those advantages, like a lot of them you kind of get out of the box already. And Atomic Design was developed in the days of things like Twig and Pug, where, like I said, you had these huge templates which were not as manageable. But in React, you have components, and of course we have composition, where you combine components, so it lends itself very naturally to Atomic Design. And I think it also encourages better design components, because again, I know I'm very bad at maybe having really long render functions which do loads of things, or doing something like this where I'll have separate render functions inside my component, because at one point I thought that React would only render certain functions but that's not true. Of course, it re-renders everything when it doesn't need to. So at 7 o'clock this morning, I made this slide and thought I was so excited about how well it proves my point. But I forgot to note down what that point actually was. So this one's more of an abstract art. Take from it what you will. And also with React 16, as we just was covered, that you can return more things from render functions. So there's really no excuse not to have these smaller components that are easier to maintain. So I think a good example of this is like rows from a table. So before, you couldn't return a single row because it didn't have an enclosing table, whereas now you can return an array. So it's a lot easier. So on paper, React and Atomic Design should work really well. But and this is a big but, and can't lie. were several teething issues. But we made the mistakes, so you don't have to. So problem one is that the sheer number of components led to a lot of ambiguity about what should go well. So what should go where. So at the beginning, we started with very strict hierarchy. So we said that if something contains an atom, then it must be a molecule. And if something contains a molecule, then it must be an organism. And that started off well. So for example, here are some typical fields and we said, okay, they're all atoms. But then we had the request that the date field should also have a date picker. So then it imported another atom, which is an icon button. And then we were like, okay, so maybe now this should be moved up to the molecule. But then that didn't really make sense because it's now being separated from all the other fields. And also, it was really painful to change all the imports. Everywhere we were using this field today was pointing at the new place. And then later on, we moved to using higher order components where we had a base field, and then the text field, number field, and date field were all part of that. So then it's like, again, should these all now be moved to molecules, and base field is just an atom? So I think solution 1A to this is that it's not worth sticking rigidly to hierarchy just for the sake of it. So if you put everything in the fields to begin with, then that's where they are. I think that should be fine. And if there's still ambiguity about where things would go, I think splitting components by purpose might help. So if you think of atoms as more like a design layer, molecules, reusability, and organisms are actually functionality things that we want to do, then that also might help help you make decisions. But if you're still unsure after all this, then I think the rule of thumb is just put it wherever feels right, and then that's where it lives. We shouldn't worry too much. So the second problem, which you may have noticed, is also in the hierarchy, we have things like templates and pages. And we don't really have templates. I mean, all React components are technically templates because you're describing a view and then you're filling it with data later. And then also, you might not even have pages. If you're a single-page application, then that layer doesn't make sense either. So some people have come across it before. There's a Medium article by Joe Donato, which is a link to the bottom, but you can't click it, but it is a link. And it describes having, instead of templates and pages, ecosystems and environment, which is something that might work for you. But we found this was a bit difficult because it just adds more of the same ambiguity you were describing earlier. So then the solution to this is just choose levels to suit your needs. And this is something we didn't realize was in the book, which is that atomic design isn't rigid dogma. So if you struggle with this, then just do whatever works. So for example, it might just be not having a templates folder, which for me is more pleasing as well because then it means everything's in alphabetical order. I did try and come up with a word which meant templates which would fit, but the best I could come up with was templates. So it didn't work. So because of this, at the beginning we did try and follow it, and we said, okay, we could have a template because here was something where we had a header and a sidebar, and then so we passed children to this component, which would then go in the middle. So it's kind of like a template. But in hindsight, we could have probably done that better using React Router. And also, roots are alphabetical. So again, there's different solutions. Problem 3 we came across was that we use Redux. I know the cool kids are using MobX these days, but they're equivalent problems. So in general, you would only connect things at higher levels, at organisms. But there are some cases where it made sense to connect lower things. So for example, we had an atom, which is a drop-down, but then we had drop-downs with options that came from an API, for example, like title or country. So then, again, using the same hierarchy rule, we originally put them in molecules, but then this created a weird problem where your molecules folder was just becoming a repeat of your atoms folder, as well as all the actual molecules. So then solution to this is maybe just creating separate folders, but internally we haven't actually agreed on what the best way to do this is, but maybe having like atom/connected might help. So problem 4 is that we use styled components as well. So if you're not familiar with them, it's visual primitives for the component age. Again, don't know what that means. But again, these are creating lots of components. So we thought, okay, maybe these should all be atoms. But then that means you have a bunch of atoms which aren't really reused anywhere. So I think the solution for this is that style components can be attached to their associated component. but there are some cases where you might want to reuse it. So a good example is maybe typography. So maybe something like this would be a good atom because it means that you can, if you want to change the font in your app, you only have to change it in one place. So the final problem that we came across is that having all these subfolders and structure meant that we had some really painful imports all over the place. So things that looking like this with lots of going up and going down. So our solution for this, which is probably just general, not just for atomic design, was using webpack aliases and an index.js file. So if you're not familiar with aliases in your webpack config, you can put something like this. And then also you need to put something equivalent in your package.json for jest if you use that. And then if you create an index file in your atoms, which looks something like this, then your import goes from something long like this to something way neater. So that was really useful when we stumbled across that. But then we had another problem, which was when you do this, then it results in painful mocking when you're testing, because mocks can't follow aliases. So this this doesn't work, or at least when we were trying it. So we had to manually do this to point to where we had defined the mocks, and then we came across the problem: you can't have two mock files with the same name. So doing this wouldn't work because you have two index.js's. So we had to do something like this. So those, and then my general tip 6 is also when you're using atomic design, that Storybook is really great. I was hoping to have some demo of that, but I didn't get a chance to prepare it. But we do have this slide. So to conclude, I think so. We covered what is atomic design, and I think the key thing is that you have this hierarchy of layers rather than just having a mess of folders all importing each other. And the advantage of that is that it's really simple for anyone to grasp, especially someone who's coming new to a project. And it results in code that I think, well, at least from what I was writing before, that's better written and easier to maintain, especially when redesigning. But there are some issues. And the key thing to remember is not to treat it as a rigid dogma. They're not rules. So I think that was the main mistake that we made. So just be pragmatic. So if that convinced you, then your next thing is I recommend reading the book. You can download it at the link at the bottom, and that's the end. Does anyone have any questions? Oh yeah, thanks for starting an applause. No one else wanted to join in, but I appreciate the effort. Any questions? Oh yeah, there's one there. Yeah. Sorry, do you mind? Could I convince you to come to the microphone? I can't. Oh, there's one.
So I've tried out atomic design over the course of kind of this year, and there's one kind of technical challenge that I've had a real problem with it. So imagine you had like a molecule which had a specific media query on it. So you had an example up there earlier in your slides, and it had a particular media query against it.
Yeah.
If you had it in an organism, in one organism it looked really good because the responsive behavior was correct. Maybe it broke at a certain breakpoint down from one piece down to 2 lines or something. But then you try and use that exact same molecule in another organism, and it looks terrible because the media queries are not tailored for that other organism. How would you kind of introduce styling overriding? So, because one issue I tried to had is how do I introduce CSS overrides to make sure responsive behavior for a molecule is correct between different organisms?
Okay, I haven't come across that particular issue. Do you use style components?
I'm using modules at the moment, CSS modules.
Okay.
I can actually show you. I've got an example. I can try and show you the pain I've had.
Okay, maybe we can take. But yeah, I don't have a specific. I've not come across that problem.
That's fair enough. No worries. Thank you.
Great. Does anyone have any more questions for Harry? No. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Oh, was there one? No.
I think this. Yeah.
So when you were breaking down your components, was that something that was design-led, or did you guys do it within your UI team? You
mean from in the refactor?
Yeah. Well, In determining what is like an atom or a molecule, was that something that was design led from your designers?
Oh
or your
no, so
engineers, or?
that did come from us. But I think in this project it was quite straightforward because it was basically just fields and buttons. But we didn't have anything more complex than that.
Okay.
But I think in that case, then using the hierarchy makes sense. So if you have a neat component that isn't using anything else, then I guess it makes sense as an atom.
Cool. Cheers.
Brilliant. Thanks. Any more? No. Okay, let's have some more beer and pizza. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks.